Hey guys, you guys got lucky. We've got a 2-for. Last week and this week, you guys get live shows. This is the return of the esteemed Kaz, who is one of the admins over at Hieros Elainoas, one of our allied servers with the bridge. He is a huge friend of the channel who has helped me out on a number of videos, at the end of which he's gotten credit for all of them. The Hubris video, the most recent video that's going to be coming out next Thursday, which is on like protective magic. He went over the whole script with me. He also helped out with the human sacrifice video, and he's planning on helping out with future ones. So huge friend of the channel, and a Greek and a scholar. So you're not just a classic scholar, but you're also Greek. So tell us a little bit about yourself for those who haven't seen you before.
Well, as you said, I am the friendly Greek classic scholar over from Hellenism. I'm currently doing a PhD student at the moment. If you've seen the last live stream, you know this spiel, but for those of you who weren't there for the last live stream, I'm doing my PhD specializing in cultural plurality between two different Mediterranean religions, the ancient Greeks and the Hittites. I focus especially on ritual practice, formulaic styles and things like prayer, as well as ancient magic, which is what I did one of my last theses on. So that's why I'm here today, because it is within my wheelhouse of things to wax lyrical about.
Yeah, actually, we were originally planning to do this stream like in April, and then I ended up getting into a car accident. We got hit by a drunk driver sitting at a light. That was not fun. Like we were sitting at the light and he hit us. So that was not at all fun. So this is actually like several months in the planning, because I had such a rocky recovery. But I believe we actually had agreed to do this stream because people were really excited about it during the Hittite stream, which after this processes, the VOD processes and everything, I will put up a link in the iCard to that stream. It is well worth watching, just if nothing else, but because we start to get into some of the similarities and differences between the two traditions and where some of like some different practices may have like syncretized. So it's actually a really cool interview. It's one of my favorites, honestly.
It was a good one. It was definitely people rewatch it. It was good. It was a good time.
It was a lot of fun. We did a lot of planning for that one too. So, holy crap, Ikeda with the $100 super chat. Welcome, Kaz. I'm sorry I missed you last time. Yeah, he was so mad at himself for missing that stream because he's a Mesopotamian revivalist himself.
We're a rare breed. We're few and far between, so.
So, the topic of this stream is a little bit contentious in the community, and we'll get into some of the background on the debate, but for some reason among the pagan traditions, I'm saying for some reason as if I don't know what some of the arguments are, like Hellenic polytheism / Hellenism, depending on which label you use. I mean, I tend to prefer Hellenism. Some folks prefer Hellpole. Just, I'll be using Hellenism and like going forward. There's this weird belief that like practicing magic is hubristic, and you know, we'll get into the grounding of some of that. Like it has some to do with stuff that Plato said. It has some to do with like this misunderstanding of what hubris is. But given that you are both a pagan and a you're actually three things. You're a pagan, you're a Greek, and you're a classic scholar. So you're like, and this is what you study. I feel like you're one of the most qualified people to kind of discuss, okay, well, let's first figure out what magic was in the ancient Greek mind. And then also, well, let's talk about hubris, and let's talk about like where these things intersect, like what the ancient debate was and what the modern was. Because to be honest, I'm getting kind of sick of seeing the arguments in the community.
Yeah, it's gonna be long. We're going to tackle some of the worst academic questions, especially when it comes to definitions.
Trying to define anything when it comes to like the emic etic perspective, which for people who don't know, emic means like in a culture's perspective, and etic means like an outsider observing like what you might interpret. So, you know, if you see somebody say, like if you were to just look at a toilet without any kind of cultural context, like trying to figure out what that's used for versus like, oh, well, as somebody in the culture, I know where the toilet goes and what it's used for in the bathroom. Like, this is what it means to me.
Well, that is the question. How could magic be hubristic? Well, that's what that's what we're all here for.
So let's start with, all right, one of the hardest things ever to define is what was magic? because the thing is our modern definitions look a bit different than what like your average ancient person might have thought.
Yeah, it's a question. It's a question that never has a satisfying answer for what is magic or what was magic in the ancient world. We kind of have to just come up with a working definition. The ancient world doesn't give us a satisfying answer, and the modern world is not that much.
It's passed through a lot of cultural filters. There's been a few thousand years of history, in fact, that have changed a lot of the way things are seen.
It's also that in the ancient world, there's the whole interplay between religion, and you have to then define religion to then define magic in relation to religion, which is generally what as academics, that's what we've settled on. We're going to define magic in relation to religion because in that society, you can't really have one without the other.
Well, that also seems to be kind of how the ancients talked about it, because like Plato, for example, who's like one of the most notorious like anti-magic critics, along with, you know, the Hippocrates and a few others. Like he very much would talk about the efficacy of the oracles while trashing on wandering Montes and trashing on Goethys. So like he very clearly in his mind saw a distinction. And I mean, like Plato, when he's complaining about something, that doesn't necessarily mean his opinion is right, but it does mean that a lot of people probably thought that.
I mean,
which is why I quote him so much, despite the fact that I don't like using him as a source. That's like if he's whinging about something, there's a very good chance a lot of people thought that, and he had an issue with it.
So, sort of. I mean, lots of people within the Platonist community would probably have an issue with it. But how many people were actually Platonists in the ancient world? Not clear, and likely actually wasn't that many. Schools of philosophy.
Well, no, what I mean is the belief he's complaining about was probably held by a lot of people, not the opinion he's expressing about it.
See, this is the thing. His basis of why he hates magic so much is all about he thinks that magic and aceivia, so impiety, are mutually exclusive, because magic claims to have some ability to coerce the gods. In Platonist philosophy, the gods can't be coerced because of the nature of the gods. Therefore, magic is impious because it is directly in opposition to Platonic philosophy. So I don't think it was necessary that a lot of people believe the same things, because that would imply that a lot of people believe the same thing about the nature of the gods. I just think
Well, I mean, clearly a lot of people believe that magic had efficacy, he wouldn't have been complaining about that belief in the first place. That's what I was saying.
Yeah. But Plato obviously doesn't believe magic has efficacy, because for it to, he would have to change what he believes is the nature of the divine. Because
so to be clear, for those who didn't catch it, what I'm saying is that if Plato is complaining about something like, say, you know, people believe in magic, the complaint about people believing in magic indicates that there's probably a lot of people who believe in magic. That's kind of what I was getting at.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna quickly address that question.
Which question?
The one from
Anti-alias polygons. Which one? I see 3 questions here.
Oh, just I was going to do the magic and coerce the gods question.
We were going to get into that a little bit after we defined it, like when we're talking a little bit about the theology of like invocations and stuff.
I was just gonna say, just on that point, it's like think of it in the same way as when you pray to a god, you're playing on your relationship with them to make them to get things to make something more likely to happen. That is the coercion in that.
Yeah, you're usually calling on either what you're giving them now or the history of Cottus, or both. You know, like the things they're interested in. Like there's a whole lot of complexity just even to the theology behind prayer and how it works.
And the wandering what it's mantes and goethys. So it's like wandering prophets is the translation used for mantes, and goethys is just basically anyone who did magic by this point. It's just
some of which also did divination.
Yeah, they're just the fancy words for specific magical professions.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like some of the Montes, like the Bacchus and the Sibyls, like which the Sibyls may or may not have wandered. Like there's debate about that from what I've read. Like some of them wouldn't have considered themselves magicians, and some of them would. Like some of them were recognized, like the Sibyls were recognized by like most folks as being like on par with the oracles.
Yeah. Yes. Anyway, back to the question. And
all right, so
definitions.
What was magic? Not what is magic. What was magic?
Okay, so for me, the personal working definition that I use, magic is a manipulative strategy of affecting the world outside of traditionally institutionalized contexts. So to break down that definition into bits, it's a manipulative strategy, therefore it's something that uses some kind of leverage, whether that's a relationship with a god or something that is associated with the divine, to exert a force on the world around you. So, death, war, love, cacodemons, whatever, through contexts that would be traditionally institutional, but is being taken out of that context and performed elsewhere. So, for example, oracles aren't necessarily classified as magic. They're done within a traditionally religious institutional context. It's part of, it's in a temple, that kind of thing. Whereas what you might call a magical ritual to do the same thing, I done a graveyard at the site of, a murder.
On the full moon.
Yeah, these are contexts that are deviant. There's a coefficient of weirdness, is a phrase used in academia.
Often you might even have to go to extra effort to do it. Like an example that I had read in Drawing Down the Moon was doves were a traditional offering to Aphrodite, and a love spell might use dove fat crafted into like a little statue as an offering.
Yeah, there's echoes of what you might find in stereotypical religious activities, but there is something extra that is done to set it apart, and it's that context that makes it magical rather than purely religious. They're like twins, but one twin has a scar on his face, and that one with the scar on his face is the one doing the magic, because it's different.
Well, and there's a really complex interplay between like magic and traditional religion. I mean, for one thing, unless you're dealing with some of the later, more syncretic stuff, there's a lot of echoes, as you said, like the prayer, for example, the tripartite structure of prayer. You have invocation, argument, request. Even the most simple prayers, like hear me, Hermes, like Lord of communication, swift-footed messenger of the gods, he who carries our prayers to Olympus, please carry my prayer to Zeus that he might hear me. Like that's a really simple kind of like invocation. And with a lot of spell formulae, what you see is that the argument, and sometimes even like the offering, has been replaced with some kind of secret knowledge, whether that's like a series of secret names or whether that's the properties of a material or things of that nature. So like the gods are still being called upon, but quite often the argument portion is replaced with something that can look coercive. And I think that that's some of where the argument for hubris sometimes come from, even though it is mistaken quite often.
Yeah. So some rituals have more coercion or like that aspect than other ones. It depends a bit on the nature of the rite in question. Some play more on this idea of like the do us a debt, so like do so I can, like, it's basically if I do this for you, then can you do that, or if you do that, then I can do this. Some have that as like the coercive section, which is more playing on traditional ideas of charis and like the relationship you have with the divine, and then other rites a bit more like aggressively coercive, basically like if you don't do this, then I won't give you this. So if you don't make my crops grow, then I won't offer to you. So it's a bit more like,
and some of them are like had this sort of syncretism with like Hecate, particularly in the Greek magical papyri, where you're like, here's this big long list of, these different secret names. And like, you gave these names to us. You're so pleased hearing them that you have no choice but to help me.
mm-hmm.
Like there's a few invocations that I saw like that. Benja, the answer to that is some of them. The Greek magical papyri are not one document. They're a whole bunch of like cookbooks and spell books.
Yeah, it's a corpus of texts from different places over like a 300-year period. written by different people from different cultural backgrounds. During this time period, you have some people, a lot of it, it's Egyptian, but there's a lot of Greek cultural influence.
Roman.
There's bits of Roman, a fair bit of early Christianity, Judaism. There's a lot going on.
Well, and the thing is like that doesn't, just because a Jewish like deity shows up doesn't necessarily mean that the person who wrote that spell was Jewish. Like there was a lot of syncretism going on between a bunch of different traditions during the Hellenistic and Roman periods.
A lot of the Jewish ones we think were probably written because at this point Judaism was quite new on the scene. So the idea of using these names was the idea that they held some kind of special power in the fact that they were obscure, that they were, held to kind of like exoticism at this point in time.
Like the nomina barbara thing, like it sounds magical because it sounds foreign.
Yeah, the weirder something sounds, the more powerful it was deemed to be. So a lot of the words don't mean anything. So a lot of the things you see in the PGM, and it's like, oh, what does this mean? Probably doesn't translate to anything because it's not meant to.
So the question then becomes, okay, well, we now know what magic is. I would argue that quite often magic also has claims of extraordinary efficacy attached to it. Like within the definition, like there's this idea that it is more likely that this thing will happen because you performed the spell, which is one of the big issues that the Hippocratic doctors took with it.
Yes, it's true. I agree with you for 90% of applications for that. There's some weird ones, like I think it doesn't necessarily work for amulets so much in a lot of ways, but I think broadly speaking, yeah, there is a claim to some increased efficacy in relation to traditional religion is there. And as you said, it's something that the Hippocratic doctors bring up when it's in terms of things like incubation, the idea that has somehow had higher efficacy than the black bile treatments of Hippocratic doctrines is definitely something going on there in the societal perceptions between magic and early science.
So anti-alias polygons, the debate about potential ancient Jewish polytheism as a scholarly debate is way beyond the scope of this stream. However, if you go check out my video about the Bible and pagan gods, like that specifically focuses on the Old Testament, aka the Jewish corpus, if you look at that, there's some very strong evidence that even if like the rabbis and such didn't like it, there was a lot of syncretism that would happen between like Jewish folks and their pagan neighbors, and there may have been some ancient evidence of particularly interplay with like Canaanite gods and things of that nature. So even if like Judaism TM may not have been polytheist, there's a lot of polytheist leanings and practices that definitely happened, and there's evidence that some god names, particularly things like El, were at one, like they're used as titles, but they were also god names in other traditions. And then there's all the complication with the Shekinah, which I'm not going to get into. So coming back to the definitions and such. So now we kind of have a working definition. So these are potentially things for extraordinary efficacy, not necessarily always, but they are practices that are outside of the religious context, but have echoes, like they have theological grounding within it. Might be syncretic, might not. So what kind of evidence do we have, apart from Plato's whinging, that the ancients were quite fond of magic? 30 curse tablets at the bottom of a well, anybody?
Yeah, the sheer
rip everybody drinking out of that well, because curse tablets were typically made of lead.
Yeah, true. Although I think in that case, a lot of them were just ostraca, just pot shard ones, which, in which case, it's fine. You can drink your water.
It said something like, I think it said that they found 30 of them and like 25 of them were lead or something like that. That's what the article I read said, because I cited it in my video because I was like, yeah, don't use lead, guys. We have better materials now.
There is a lot of like evidence to at least show that it was heavily applied, and the fact that it's heavily applied means that people used it. And like, even if Plato, for example, creates this idea of a negative view towards the practice, our material evidence doesn't line up because we have just so much of it over such a long period. It's one of these situations where our written evidence is a lot more lacking than our physical evidence in terms of things outside of like fiction. So when it's not like plays or things that aren't very obviously hyperbole, but in terms of like physical objects, there's just so much. Curse tablets are everywhere. Amulets span from, you know, the 8th century BC into, you know, the Imperial Roman period. It's going on forever, and it's
Well, I mean,
it's
in the Odyssey, like there's a quote in the Odyssey that which is thought to date back all the way to the Bronze Age, talking about like Odysseus getting a charm set over his wounds to staunch the bleeding when he gets wounded by a boar. Like it's just an offhand mention, but like it's obvious that there's this like indigenous magic practice. So like myth busted number one. And this is something I actually used to believe before I did a whole bunch of research for my original magic video. Not all Greek magic was imported and syncretic. The Greeks like to talk about magic like it came from the outside and like assaulted them, but there's a definitively indigenous magic tradition in Greece.
Yeah.
By indigenous, I mean it developed there.
We have a question. Please correct if I'm wrong, but I've always thought that. No, so the Roman ones.
Read out the question.
Sorry. Please clarify if I'm wrong, but I've always thought lead curse tablets are more of a Roman thing than a Greek thing. Not saying they never did it, but speaking from an origin/popularity standpoint. That emoji's in the way. So the ficciones, the Roman version, were very popular. It's true, but katadeismoi, so the Greek version, lead was still one of the most common materials used to make them, and they were common.
We have them going all the way back to the like 5th and 6th century.
The difference is that
they're a lot less complex, but they existed.
Roman curse tablets were almost exclusively lead. Greek curse tablets were often lead, but you also got curse tablets made from pot shards, gold
Papyrus.
occasionally. Yeah, there's a bit more of a range in materials for the Greek katadeismoi in comparison to Roman deficciones.
There's also a pretty big range in quality too. Like there's some that were clearly done by like professionals, but like there's also some where like somebody decided to attempt themselves.
Yeah, but no, they were still pretty big. They weren't as uniform.
They're really petty, some of them too.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Humans are still humans. Like reading some of the curse tablets, it's like, oh, so that's what people were concerned about in their day-to-day lives.
So we've got 2 questions on the same thing, essentially. So this is from Polygons again. Back on the subject of magic, especially dealing with like amulets and such, how do you feel about potential psychosomatic elements? And then kind of linked is, do amulets have an effect because it's believed they did, and the mind made it real? Like, where does the will end and spirit begin? I mean, the psychosomatic aspect probably did have an element, but just because something's psychosomatic doesn't make it real. In fact, something that's psychosomatic is real and measurable. You can measure
so you mean it doesn't make it not real? You said it doesn't make it real.
Oh yeah, sorry. Just because something's psychosomatic doesn't make it not real. These things are useful, if for nothing else, to shift you into a different mindset, which is, you know, very important to things like trance work, which was still a thing in ancient Greece. Because they believed in it, that definitely did add power to what was happening. As to where the will ends and the spirit begins, I don't know.
I feel like that's kind of out of the scope of this video too, because we're working from the belief that, okay, well, like magic, we're working from the belief of somebody who believes that either magic does work or at the very least, like it's possible to practice, and we're trying to figure out theologically what does that mean for a practitioner. This isn't really a stream where we're trying to debate the efficacy of it.
I think the important thing to bear in mind is that regardless of what we might think of like how it worked for them, it worked. It was, you know, it was mystical.
Yeah, if you're talking about the emic perspective.
Yeah. For them, it worked, and, you know, psychosomatic that didn't exist yet. So for them, it began and ended with spirit and probably personal intent, obviously, too.
So just so you guys know, by the way, we will have a question section at the end, but we do need to get through the groundwork. And if we get bombarded with too many questions on just kind of like off topics that we're talking about, we won't be able to get through everything we wanted to cover. So with that in mind, the prefab curse tablets, the answer is yes. In the Hellenistic and Roman era, they did have prefab curse tablets. I think we found a few of them in the classical era. Like those primarily were probably created by more popular, like well-known Goethas, like the professional sort of that we've also found. But coming back to, okay, so we're now talking about what kind of evidence. So curse tablets are a lot of the evidence that we found. There's a ton. And amulets, there's a ton of those. But amulets are kind of complicated because sometimes you got them from the temples and sometimes they were homemade, or you got them from a Goethis. Like they're also one of those things where, you know, where does magic end and religion begin? Like it's really murky.
Yeah, I think the amulets that, so you get very plain amulets, you know, it's just a stone, or it's a tube that has some papyrus inside of it. Other ones, though, you have things like, you know, the Ephesiagrammata, those weird words that make no sense, carved into them, or you'll have some composite deity that's out of place depicted on, you know, a garnet or what have you. This
or a symbol that has no correspondence to any known language,
yeah,
that like might represent the name of some secret name of a god.
Yeah, it goes back to, you know, as you said, you know, this kind of like efficacy tied to this, you know, weirdness, this things being different. You'll find that on some amulets, whereas other ones you don't get it as much. I think amulets do very much span the gap between religion and magic, since they have a very distinctly religious flavor, but they aren't always necessarily perpetuating standard religious iconography.
Well, some of the coolest amulets that I found in my research were the ones where you would have like gemstones inlaid into like a brooch or into like a, you know, a ring or something like that. And like you wouldn't be able to see the etchings of the magical symbols. Like it just looked like your ordinary ring, but there's like etchings on the gemstone itself, like these impossibly tiny etchings.
Yeah, oftentimes they're not always on the side that would be put out to people to see. You have it on the other side.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about with like the secret thing. Like it's like they're not on display.
Yeah, it's also there's this whole the law of contagion, so they had it on that side, so it'd be touching your skin, because physical contact in that way was what, you know, transferred the power of the amulet to the body, depending on what the amulet was for. You'll often get healing. Amulets will have it on the verso, and then if it's like a protection one, it'll be on the front, because one is meant to be projecting that kind of thing outwards, and the other one's meant to be giving it to you.
Well, and there's also the interesting ones that are like buried on the property or like mounted on like poles. Like there's all kinds of, there was also one that was like, it was meant to be carried by like the general of a squadron that was going out, and like it was meant to protect the whole squadron. So like it was projected out over everybody. Corey, there will be a whole video coming out next week all about a bunch of different uses. The answer is all the things. If you're scared of it, they probably made an amulet for it.
And if you're not scared of it, there's probably an amulet for it too.
Yeah, it's probably like it's somebody is scared of it, and there's an amulet for them. And if there isn't, then you go find your local Goethis, and they'll probably make you one. So like talking a little bit about that, it's pretty clear that like the sheer amount of stuff we've found, it was a pretty common belief. Like, you know, people might have poo-pooed it in the streets and then just like gone to their local Goethis at a graveyard in the middle of the night and just like, you know, shelled it out. Because there does seem to have been kind of this weird gray area where some kinds of magic, particularly curses, were really widespread, but they weren't exactly socially looked positively upon as far as we can tell, even though everybody did them anyway.
Yeah, it's no one wants to say that they're cursing their neighbors, but everyone's cursing their neighbors. It's
Pentheus might say he's cursing his neighbors.
Yeah. it's like at the end of the day, it's a world riddled with uncertainty, and people want to have control over things. And cursed habits were a way to do that. If you're going to court, and you want to win that court battle because you don't want to have the punishment. Obviously, you're not going to go and tell the other team, I'm cursing you so you can't speak well.
I've bound the tongue of your witnesses.
Yeah. But you're going to do it because if you think you're on the weaker foot, you're going to do everything you can to give yourself the best chance. And this was a way.
I mean, heck, even if you don't think you're going to lose, just to make sure that it's your opponent's probably doing it, so you should buy an amulet for protection and curse them just to make sure that your curse is better. It
was an option that was at their disposal that they believed had an actual impact, so they were going to do it. But it doesn't mean it was something that you stood in the middle of the street and shouted about.
I mean, it's kind of like modern magic, to be honest.
Yeah, it's also because, generally speaking, and this is slightly a later on topic, but I'm going to touch on it anyway. Cursing itself wasn't illegal; you could do it.
At least until the Roman Empire started to ban a lot of things.
But the impact from cursing could be punished. There's the blabe, which is the damage done from magic. You could be punished for that legally. But the actual creation of this cursed tablet wasn't a punishable offense. So you didn't tell people you were making it, because then if it worked, you could get in trouble because you've damaged that person. Whereas just making it itself isn't a problem.
Unless you're in the Roman Empire during a certain era when they started banning stuff.
Yeah, we don't like the Romans. We'll leave those to their own shenanigans.
Well, we have a lot of evidence from them. In fact, they're the reasons we have a lot of evidence, because that's when a lot of stuff started getting systematized. But that's also a topic for a future video. We are planning another stream eventually on the ancient Greek and Roman and Egyptian roots of modern occultism, because a lot of modern occult beliefs have their roots in Greek and Roman and Egyptian philosophy and theology. In fact, the vast majority of them do, because Renaissance people were like, ooh, look at this, dude, shiny, and I have no cultural context for it whatsoever. Let's just start making stuff up to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
Which I'm not dogging on modern occultism. It's just that's where a lot of this stuff that's kind of foundational that went into a lot of these mystery traditions came from. But that's neither here nor there. So you have cursing was common. Amulets, on the other hand, people were far more likely to show off. In fact, some of them were so well crafted that they were likely even heirlooms.
Yeah, we have, when it comes to amulets or votive objects, so not necessarily an amulet you'd have on you, but an object that was placed somewhere that was meant to have certain powers, like the metallic dogs of Hephaestus that were meant to have apotropaic functions, or mythological automata. Those, people showed those off because they, one, they were fancy, but also they were apotropaic. So you showed them off because they were protective. It's like, look at this. It's like having a really fancy security system. It's like,
the shipwreck rings are probably another example of that, because some of them were really finely crafted and very, very pretty, and they could have even been heirlooms, in families where sea travel was a core part of their family work. Because remember, guys, we're talking about a time where most people, they probably, unless you were really rich, you probably grew up in the same house your entire life, and you probably learned your trade from your dad, if you got to have one, if you were born with the correct set of genitals to learn a trade. Because we're talking about a pretty profoundly misogynistic culture, even by ancient standards.
Except for weaving, you could weave. That could be your.
You could weave all of the things, and in fact, you had to weave. Actually, you had to weave until your fingers bled, because if you didn't, then there would be no clothes.
Weave for your life.
Yeah, pretty much weave for your life. Apotropaic means protective. It can also mean propitiatory.
It's it's like apotropaic is to avert, to send back nasty things,
which sometimes in the Greek mind could be both. You could try to avert the wrath of a god by propitiating them, or you could avert something else by using the favor of a god, which is what a lot of Greek magic was built around.
Yeah, it's from the Greek word apotropein, which literally means to ward off.
So, with that in mind, in our sort of little outline of things we wanted to cover, the next step would be okay, so we have a working definition. We kind of have some idea of, okay, well, we know clearly people use this in ancient times, especially during the period where it was outlawed. Like, you don't outlaw something people aren't doing.
Also, it's very
Everybody's
big
got
during the Peloponnesian War. Any conflicts, magic skyrockets.
that pretty much. And so, like, let's get into all right, well, what's hubris then? And this is an interesting topic because I did a whole video on hubris, and there are what is hubris in a theological context? Because in a legal context, you're looking at something a bit different.
Yeah. Again, not everyone agrees on what hubris is, modern day and ancient day. Generally, like 90% of the time, everyone agrees that the central thing for hubris is the concept of shame. For something to be hubristic, you're bringing shame on someone else. Your intent, you cause someone else to feel shame. That's the core of what hubris is. If you
So Aristotle kind of also defines it slightly differently, which is like causing shame and feeling pleasure from the act, whether it's pleasure of the causing shame or causing shame for another for your own pleasure. Which there's a distinction related to stuff like cheating that was actually a little bit of a debate that we got into earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. Which so yes. So earlier on we were talking about love magic and whether love magic can be classified as like the only kind of magic that is hubristic.
In certain contexts.
Yeah.
Because both of us were like, not all love magic all the time is, but like if you're trying to like hook somebody who's married, maybe it is.
Mm-hmm. I personally don't cancel me. I'm not problematic. I said it's not hubristic because generally the way that magic is written is that bringing shame isn't the pleasure, the end goal isn't bring shame to a person. It's the formulas of ancient love magic is that X normally is a woman, was already mine and she was coerced or misled or taken from me by other man. Therefore, this isn't a spell to bring shame on a man, it's to bring justice for a wrong committed against me. Therefore, it avoids the hubris loophole.
Which is some incel stuff because like well the thing is like that when I was talking with Kaz about this earlier, I was like, yeah, but like agency though, I mean obviously there wasn't a lot of that in ancient times, but even then like it evokes kind of the whole nice guy like, oh, I was so nice to you, and like she might never have actually been into you, so like nothing was actually lost and you just think that. But there's also the spell that's like literally claiming this person like slandered a goddess that you have to get like a protective like amulet for in the PGM, where it's like, oh, she slandered you and you need this protective amulet so the goddess doesn't like screw you over, and she's supposed to inflict this like horrible eros on them toward you as punishment for that. And that, I think that spell specifically might be hubris because you're lying that this person slandered a goddess in order to get the goddess to punish that person.
Yeah, but again, even then, if we're going for shame as being central, it's shame. There's no shame in that. You're not shaming a person. It's cruel. It's
remember, shame has to do with lying, though. You're lying that this person said all these things about a goddess in order to get the goddess to punish them. So you are, in fact, shaming their character. You're basically accusing them of Vesalia.
It's defamation.
I mean, that was more or less like defamation was like 80% of legal hubris, though.
Exactly, but now we're going into legal hubris. We're on philosophical, theological hubris.
Yeah, but I mean, like,
if we're going to legal hubris, then yes, hubris is a legal term. Then yes, it would fit in there. But I don't think that. I feel like when it comes to magic, it's the theological hubris that is carrying the weight here.
So here's the other question, though. If you are the one saying all these horrible things about the goddess, right? And that person didn't, that means you're still saying all these horrible things about the goddess, which means that, like, you're willing to say those things that shame the goddess. Thereby, you are the one committing hubris there. You're not only shaming the person, but you're also shaming the goddess. And, like, you're getting the goddess to punish that person for the shame that you just did.
Yeah, but you're not shaming. You're insulting the goddess. But I'm not sure that's necessarily equating it to, because you're not making the goddess feel bad about herself. You're just saying that someone
Well, yeah,
else
but remember,
is
shame
saying
had more to
things.
do with truth and like reputation in ancient times than it did like your self-esteem.
Yeah, it's true. That's fair.
So like that's kind of more of a modern definition of shame here. If we're talking about like the context in which that spell was written, absolutely you're trying to like slander the goddess's reputation. That's why she's going to punish this person, because you're claiming that they did that.
But yeah, because that's I'm still I agree with you that there's slander involved and there's lying involved. And in terms of legal hubris, that is very much the groundwork of it. However, when you find it in theology, the lying isn't necessarily the hubristic part.
Well, usually when you see theological hubris, the lying is thinking that you're as good as the gods, which is a lie, or you're better than them. Like that's where most of your theological hubris comes from.
But the truth and lie part isn't the important part there. The important part in that one is that you're putting yourself to be above someone else so that you can then make them feel small. Whether that's a truth or a lie isn't important. You could very much actually be higher up than a person and still commit hubris. For example, if you're a king and you use that stature to make your subject feel unworthy, that can still be hubris. It's still the truth that you are higher up than that person. Doesn't mean you're immune to it being a hubristic act.
Yes, Akeda, that spell is a false flag Agos attractor. That is exactly what that spell is supposed to be. And again, it's so dangerous, like that the spell writer was like, here, you have to actually hold this amulet the entire time, and like the goddess is gonna try to knock it out of your hand. You gotta really hold on to that amulet, because if you lose it, she's gonna punish you, and you'll be up shit creek.
Yeah, there's a few cases in the PGM of like safety net amulets in certain rituals. Was like, here, have this just in case.
Yeah, this ritual was just so complete. I actually used it as an example in my video that's upcoming next week, and like that's one of the reasons why it stuck out in my mind, is like, here's an example. But that debate you guys just heard from us kind of shows, even in ancient times, there were a lot of differing definitions of what hubris was, between theology, between legality. So this is where we start to get into, well, what were some of the ancient arguments that magic was hubris? One of the big ones was the oldest arguments we have against magic come from like the Hippocratic school. And the one of the most complete documents we have that's kind of like dunking on that idea is this piece where the Hippocratic doctor was claiming that like Goethys and other magic like Magoe, Goethys, etc., were slandering the gods because they claimed that diseases came from them, and thereby they were slandering the gods, and that was hubristic. Because like in order for their magical cures to be efficacious, then that means that the diseases had to come from the gods, and they would even diagnose like which god was angry at you based off of your symptoms. The paper was specifically about like epilepsy and whether or not it was like a disease the god inflict, which is what a lot of the magicians believed, versus this person was arguing that it was a physical malady that we just didn't understand yet. Obviously, we know what the truth is now, but like in terms of that argument, there's one point in this art like paper where the guy's like, yeah, they should totally take all that refuse like that comes out of their patients and take it to the temple, because like that's clearly where they think it came from. Which, if you know anything about bodily fluids and how the Greeks viewed that, that's it's both gross and also really like that's shots fired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not endorsing the opinion, by the way, guys. Like,
No.
it's a really entertaining piece to read if you read through it, because the guy then like he's like dunking on dietary prescriptions, and then he gives nearly identical ones, which is hilarious.
Yeah, it's, the Hippocratic ones are that it's an interesting. They're a bit less like the Platonists. They're like they stick to it. They're very much like, I don't like it, well, whatever. The Hippocratic doctors are like, we don't like it, but we're also going to do something really similar at the same time, but then tell you that it's not the same.
Well, I mean, the treatments often look different, but I think the grounding beliefs between the two were what kind of distinguished them. Like where like the Homeric sort of school of magic, like the magical sort of cure idea, like, if you can't determine a physical cause, then it must be metaphysical. Whereas the Hippocratic doctors were like, no, disease is typically not metaphysical. Like, the reason that these similar cures work is because of the pharmacological properties of the plant.
Yeah, I always struggled with the Hippocratic basis of it what makes it hubristic, and obviously the whole point is that the gods are incapable of doing bad. They're incapable of being evil, which fair enough. I feel like it's a false kind of like end point, because just because you say that diseases come from the divine doesn't necessarily mean that the gods are evil, because that means you have to give disease an evil nature. And if you accept that disease is just disease, it is what it is.
It's equating suffering with evil.
Yeah, if it's just doing what it does, then it's not evil. Therefore, it can come from the gods, because disease is just natural. It's not evil. You will suffer from it, but that's a human condition, because we are mortal and therefore can suffer. And therefore, that for me, that doesn't end up with a hubristic end point, because it's not claiming what the rhetoric is trying to say necessarily claiming.
Okay, so Zodiac Emma asks, well, if they think it's hubris to say God made you sick, what did they think it did? Which era are you talking about of the Hippocratic school? Because you have like humor theory, you have the vapor theory. There was also ideas around, like if you're, for example, AFAB, your womb might just have detached itself and decided to start wandering around your body, was another thing that they thought could happen.
Yeah.
Remember that there was a really strong taboo against cutting a human body open, even after you're dead. Like vivisection of any kind, even with animals. Like with animals, it was significantly more accepted. With humans, vivisection was really, really taboo. So the Greeks didn't have the best understanding of human anatomy.
Yeah. Also, it's worth saying that the Hippocratic school did believed it was hubris to say the gods made you ill, not the population generally. But generally,
Yeah.
it was quite normal to say that getting sick had some kind of divine origin. It's not even outside of Greece at this point in history. Everywhere was saying that disease was a sign of the gods being unhappy.
Same with things like birth defects and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the Hippocratic school was kind of somewhat of an outlier in the tangent they were taking away from a divine basis for illness. That they were kind of unique in that. It definitely was not the overarching opinion of people at this point in time. Most people were still believing that sickness came from.
This is one of those reminders. Rich men who wrote stuff down are not the majority of ancient people. Most people couldn't even read the stuff these guys were writing down. So, like, our written evidence that we have in the form of, like, the philosophers, the Hippocratic school, all that sort of thing, it's where a lot of modern people get their opinions, but, like, just general everyday culture, like, for example, going back to the toilet example, is your opinion of your toilet based off of like what you use it for and how you grew up experiencing it, or is it based off of the owner's manual? If you only had access to the owner's manual and like shards of toilets and just like the tangential mentions of it in novels and such, you'd have a very different view of what a toilet is culturally than if you were talking to somebody who is actually interacted with one. The shining example of something like this is actually like toothbrushing. Like there was a paper that was written, like the Habits of the Nasarema is a really famous paper. Go look it up. But it's like it's a paper that is describing toothbrushing in this really intimate, detailed, like anthropological sense, and like it got published, and people didn't realize that was what it was describing. But it's really easy to fall into that trap where you assume that everything that's written that we have surviving, like the survivorship bias, is an issue. I wouldn't. I mean, yes, but that's kind of everything in ancient Greek and Roman anything. Like, talk to 3 different Greeks, they probably had different opinions. But like the common people clearly did believe magic was efficacious enough that we have a boatload of evidence showing how much they used it.
Mm-hmm.
So now we've got like the Hippocratic school where like, gods and illness, that's a bad thing. But like they didn't really take issue with other kinds of magic. Then you get the Platonists and especially the Neoplatonists. And like the Platonists, Plato had to stick up his butt about a lot of stuff. I tend to beef with him a lot because of how much he hated poets. But he's also the source for a lot of the anti-magic hate. So let's get into Plato a little bit, because he was an angry man who just got angrier with time.
Yeah, he got angry to the point where certain people who practice magic, his belief was that they should be put to death, that they should be killed. It's in his laws. He splits up. There's honest believers, dishonest believers, and private religion. But basically, his TLR.
He thought any private religion was a threat to the state.
Yeah, so his TLR was that magic is inherently linked to acedia in impiety, due to the belief that one could coerce the gods through magic, and therefore led to impious beliefs, which would then affect, the social stability.
He especially had an issue with any kind of like purification type magic. Yeah. Like, how dare you believe you can fuck up and then like get better ever?
He also was more inclined to punish the experts than the average person, because if you were the experts, you had the wit and you had the charisma, and that made you more dangerous. If you was an average person, there was this place called, I think it was like the House of something or other. I forget the name. It's in my old thesis. It's like a special room that you would send people to like rehabilitate them, so that you saw the error of your ways and you got better.
He also was let's put this into context. He was also a proponent of like getting all of the smartest people into a room, like forcing them all to bang each other, and then like creating a a class of ruler philosophers, because he believed that like your kids would be as smart as you because genetics. So like we're talking about somebody who believes in eugenics.
Yeah, he was not a fan. But it's interesting that you brought up the Neoplatonists, because they're a bit of a shaky ground when it comes to their opinion on magic, and this goes into a whole kind of different debate, but it centers around Theurgy.
Definitely not magic. Definitely not at all. Nope, not it might look like magic, it might quack like magic, you might even be doing all of the same kind of sounds, and it also kind of came from Egypt, maybe, and did lots of inspiration from different places. It's definitely a syncretic, but we promise it's not magic.
Yeah, but if being honest, Theurgy is magic. Theurgy is magic with a specific goal, which is union with the divine.
Sometimes. Because remember, Plotinus also claimed that he could change the weather and do all the things the magicians could.
Yeah. A lot of the Neoplatonists had a less harsh opinion of magic than Plato did.
As long as it was Theurgy and not Goethys, because they would dunk on the magicians. They also are not magicians themselves, even though they kind of are.
Yeah, this is when you get to this whole false dichotomy between Theurgy and Goetia being two, entirely different, non-compatible things. When really, in the earlier days, they were essentially just the same thing. But a lot of the Neoplatonists do have a positive opinion on specific kinds of magic for specific goals, but then other kinds of magic they're still against. Plato was the most extreme example, and then kind of as time went on, the kind of extremity of it got less bad for the most part. Porphyry was an interesting one. But Plotinus did bits, Iamblichus did bits.
Yeah, Plotinus and Iamblichus both were probably like the most lenient, and like Iamblichus and one of them, I think it was Plotinus, but it might have been Iamblichus, claimed that like he could change the weather because of Theurgy.
I think that was.
Whichever one came up with the hierarchy of souls with like the philosophers at the top.
I'm fairly sure that was Plotinus. I think it's in the Aeneads somewhere.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Plotinus. Like that's what my initial instinct was, but I was like, it might have been Iamblichus, because like Iamblichus had some interesting. He did a lot of commentary on like the Egyptians and stuff.
Yeah. He did the mysteries. Mysteries of Egypt, what they're called. Yes, Platonism, Neoplatonists themselves, not necessarily waxing about how hubristic it is, but Plato was very much on team magic is bad.
Very much so. And so, like, let's now, I guess that kind of leads us into, so that's where a lot of those arguments start in the modern community is, brief history without getting into any sort of specific drama. Very early on, in the sort of Hellenist movement online, a large portion of some of the largest communities were more on the Neoplatonist side, because like Julian Hellenism is one of the earliest sort of like traditions that kind of came into its own. You also have some pretty heavily influenced, like in Greece itself, it's considered like you have to study a lot of the philosophers before you can kind of even get into praxis, like with some of the orgs. I've been interfacing quite a lot with Labris, and like talking to some of them, and they think it's very strange how not learned a lot of pagans are over here. Like it's one of those things that like we clash on a little bit. And so there's this kind of idea that like the modern tradition, like there especially, the modern tradition is growing on this like gigantic pile of like progress, and they also tend to integrate a lot of later philosophers that may not have had the best opinion on magic as well, like like well into the Christian era. There's a couple of philosophers that get cited quite a lot in Greece that we don't talk about very much here. And so you end up with Plato, especially, is kind of considered to be core to a lot of that study, and that was very much the way that early like Hellenic polytheism and Hellenism on the internet was kind of taught. So you ended up with a lot of quote unquote Hellenist communities that were actually Neoplatonist communities. And the founder of Julian Hellenism, like as a tradition as we recognize it now, and like the main website on that, and some of the other sort of beginning traditions, there's an Orphic tradition as well that's kind of like a mystery tradition that you have to get a teacher for. They were very much of that opinion because of like the Platonist philosophers, that like, well, Theurgy might be fine if you're in the Orphic tradition, but like definitively these other kinds of magic are not. So do you want to get into a little bit on where some of those arguments come from? Obviously, they come from Plato partially, but part of it also has to do with the invocations and the spells, like we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. As I said earlier on in relation to Plato, his issue is this. A lot of the hubris is based on this idea of humans being able to exert influence over the gods, and therefore that is a lot of times the baseline of what is then used of what to justify why magic is hubristic, because you're saying that you can, in some cases, force the gods to do things. It's an argument that a lot of people hear and go, yeah, that makes sense, but that's bad. You shouldn't be, threatening the gods, etc., etc., etc.
Even though there's actually a theological basis for that, it's just syncretic.
Yeah, I mean, even there's that, and there's also the idea that there's a give and take relationship between worshippers and the gods that exists in ancient Greek thought. That
that's what reciprocity is.
Yeah, you do things for the gods, and then in return, the gods are more likely to do things for you. A lot of the basis of these kind of coercive things is saying, a lot of the formula is, do you remember when I did this for you? Can you therefore do that for me? Or alternatively, can you do this to me so then in the future I can do that for you?
Which is like in normal Greek prayer too. Like you can find this all the way back in the Iliad and the Odyssey. You will literally see like there are prayers, if ever I have poured like libations of sweet wine and burned the smoke of fat and fat thighs for you, hear me now. Like that kind of invocation, especially in emergencies, was like it was something you would do if you, especially like you say, didn't have an offering and you desperately needed a god's help. Like that's a normal part of religion. It's just now being applied to this outside of religious context with other weird stuff. And so it's a lot easier to condemn it, even though it's very much a core part of theological thought for most ancient Greeks.
Mm-hmm. The ones where people then get bigger issues are the ones that involve threats of abstaining. If you don't do this, I won't give you this. People have issues with this because it creates this idea that the gods, in one way or another, have some kind of reliance on worship, what is given to them by their worshippers, and that's what must give the power to this threat. And people don't like the humanization that kind of brings, that the gods need something from us. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way of looking at it.
Well, I mean, like, there's also something to believe. Like, I don't need my rats or my lizard, which we were talking about lizards earlier. Like, I don't need them, but I feed them and I take care of them and I enjoy their presence and I interact with them. And like, obviously, it's not a necessity, but their existence in my life benefits me. They give me entertainment, they give me companionship. So, like, obviously, like the gods might not necessarily need us, but they might like us.
Yeah, and the people, one of the kind of the best examples people have used is obviously comparing it like a king and his subjects. Like your subjects don't have to like you, but it's definitely better if if they give you you know they pay the taxes. You want to have a good relationship with the people you're meant to be ruling over.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of us that are like, hey, I'm fine paying my taxes, because of the fact that I know that at least a portion of it is going to, like, say, people who need food, like food stamps.
Mhm.
I don't have a problem with food stamps existing in the States because, like, I'm happy that some of my money is going to take care of people who are less fortunate than I am.
Mhm. And then the last bit is linked to these kind of weird words we were talking about earlier. Some of the rituals in the PGMs say, if you say this incantation, the god will be compelled to do Y action. It's very like a straight line between if you do this, then the god will do this because of these words. Um,
And
and
some of that has grounding in Heka.
it has grounding in that's an Egyptian tradition. Also, these words are often believed to in somehow, in some way, come from the gods themselves. Usually, the magician will claim to have gained special knowledge from the divine that bestowed upon him these words.
Or they were passed down, because like some of that in Heka especially was this idea that like proto humans, like the very first humans, were given, a few of them were given these words and these names, and they were passed down and passed down, and only a chosen few know them, but they were given to humanity explicitly because they pleased the gods so much that they are now compelled to help you.
Yeah, it's kind of it's not at that point. It's not human power being able to compel the gods. It's the gods' power compelling the gods, because the point of the words is that they are divine themselves.
Which again,
So
like writing, especially being divine, is a very Egyptian thing.
yeah, it's not really it's not a person attempting to put themselves on the same level as the gods. It's a person saying this is, godly knowledge that I'm then using to to I'm using divine stuff to influence divine stuff, rather than I have become divine myself.
Yeah, like one of the ones that I cited in a video a while back was, there's this one where it's like, I know you Hermes, your secret like your secret animal is like the something or other baboon, your
Yeah.
secret color is this. And it's like you're impressing the god with all of this secret knowledge. Like, look how well you're basically saying, look how well I know you. Look how strong of a relationship we have. I have learned these secret things you gave to humanity. I am now showing you that I know this. You must be overjoyed. So please, I've gone to all of these lengths. Help me. Like, it's still a request, but it's being made as a command, in the same way that, like, if you're struggling or something and you're asking your friend for help, you're like, hey, look at, like, hey, like, I was there when your daughter was born. I helped bring you to your, like, I helped bring you to your first, like, kiss. Like, I played wingman to you at the bar the other day. Can you please come help me out here? Like, can you come pick me up from jail? That kind of thing. Right? Like, if you're trying to get your friend to do something that they might not want to, like reminding them of things you've done in the past and reminding them of stuff you know about them and how close you are. Like, it's, hey, I know that this sucks, but like, can you help me out here? Because like, look how close we are.
Mm-hmm. Akita says, aren't claims of secret knowledge kind of scammy? They're suspicious. I mean, they're always going to, especially again, as Emma says afterwards, in the modern days, then yes, they're definitely kind of, they smell of a scam. But in the time of this evidence, it was,
I mean, some people thought they were even in ancient times
yeah,
too. Like, there were lots of people who
yeah,
sold spell books, and like they sold different divination systems. And like, again, you have writers that are like aggrandizing them, and then you have writers that are like dunking on them. Theophrastus
yeah,
especially like really went after divination and spell systems.
yeah.
But like
Although,
the PGM, a lot of them were
yeah,
also like almost advertising for
yeah.
like the
But
services
even
it would put down.
Theophrastus still admits that plants can have magical properties. So
Somehow, maybe, sometimes.
yeah, yeah, he has a tiny little section just being like, okay, well, maybe these ones are special. We'll move on.
Yeah, or at least people think they are, and maybe there's a reason why, but I don't know.
Yeah, but
Squill,
no,
I
yeah,
noticed, was one of the ones he kind of endorsed a little bit.
yeah, but yeah, no, secret knowledge can be was a cause of suspicion both back then and today. But on the other hand, it you know, it does add a certain, you know, aspect of power to a spell if you've got words that no one else can understand and may or may not have some link to the gods that you're trying to get to help you with shit. So yeah, so it's hit and miss.
So let's see what other, like, let's get into then. So now we have a couple of the ancient arguments. So we have the Hippocratics, which, like, they were like, you know, how dare you think the gods cause disease, which again, you know, has some of the same grounding and ideas that you see with like the Neoplatonists and the Pythagoreans.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like the Platonists who are like, well, magic, or Plato was like, magic's bad for the state. And then you have the Platonists, which were competing with magic with Theurgy, which, like, honestly, that seemed to be a lot of why they didn't like magic, was like, Theurgy's better, even though it's definitely not just magic in a trench coat.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the mistaken modern beliefs, because this is where, when you have 2,000 years of separated context from some of these texts, it can be really hard to understand what kind of debates were going on. One of the big ones, I think, for modern folks, like, let's try to steelman some of these arguments a little bit. One of the big ones is, okay, you're putting yourself above the gods.
Yeah, which
itself must be slander when we go back to the definition. Oh, you are taking pleasure in slandering the gods because you're putting yourself above them by claiming you can command them.
Yeah. Generally, no, because 90% of magic doesn't necessarily involve this slandering aspect, if you want to call it the slandering aspect, at all. It's a lot of it is, here is the spell, I'm giving it over to the gods to do it. Most of it is, you know, magic isn't personal agency. It's, I would like this to happen, and I'm asking the gods or a daemon to carry it out on my behalf. You know, it's like,
unless you're cursing, in which case you're probably trying to force a daemon to do it. Well, you're still asking the gods nicely, probably in your ritual.
Yeah, I mean, cursing. Cursing has very, very few occasions where the magician is meant to be doing anything under his own power. Most of it is praying to underworld deities to do something. It's, you know, I invoke.
Hey, can you release this spirit that I just grabbed?
Yeah.
And sometimes the spirits were promised, because remember, a lot of these spirits are like trapped on Earth. Like, typically, if you're doing a curse tablet, you're typically trying to invoke somebody's spirit who they died in a bad way, or they weren't buried, or like they, you know, died before they got to fulfill their duties to the Greek state. So, like, there was this belief. If you watch my video on ghosts, which, like, my video on necromancy was actually another one that Kaz helped out with. But if you watch my video on ghosts, it talks a lot about how a lot of daimons, like, their manner of death was important. And so, like, when you're talking about curse tablets and stuff, some of them even promise, if you do this for me, it will purify you so that you can then actually go into the underworld, because, like, being trapped on Earth sucks in Greek theology. So even commanding the daimons isn't a bad thing necessarily, like, within the cosmology of the magic system.
Yeah, it's very rare. I would say, even in my opinion, even the kind of coercive spells, don't put yourself above the gods, because you're actually not forcing to do anything, because there's not anything that says, well, there's very rarely anything that says that the gods can't just not do it. There's somewhere it's like, if you do this, then this will happen. That's with like the magic words and stuff. But a lot of the spells have this kind of clause of, this might not work. If this doesn't work, try this other thing, and not have like 3 different rituals, because if one doesn't work, you do a different one. It's not putting yourself as an absolute power that can force the gods to do something. It's, you're generally asking the gods to do something, and generally promising them something in return. It's a transaction. It's not usually, you don't become a force that can force the gods to do something. Daemons are
spells are also very bombastic, though. Like, one of the other things is, like, you gotta be convinced entirely, and there are like treatises on magic that talk about, like, your belief actually boosts the efficacy of the thing. So, like, you talk about the Psychosomatic, they did talk about that, but there's also, you're almost becoming a used car salesman for the result you want. And that's where some of these invocations are being so forceful, is it's not you're commanding the god, it's you're really trying to pitch whatever it is you're trying to get. And so, like, you're being as forceful and bombastic and loud and forward as you possibly can to like really draw the god's attention, like, from all the other sacrifices that might be going on right now, to help you right now.
And you do get ones where you do directly command daemons, but you command them in the name of a different. So basically, you use a higher god, a god that is higher up this divine hierarchy, to command a daemon to do something, because daemons are in magical formula and also philosophical treatises. Daemons are like the lesser deities. They're still divine, but they're lower down on this ladder.
Sometimes.
And you can use your relationship with a more powerful god to get the daemons to do something. So, for example, if you had really good chorus with Apollon, you could be like you could invoke that relationship you have with this higher god to be like to get a lesser deity, a lesser divine being, to do something. But again, that's not you. It's you're working through your relationship with a god to get this other thing to do something.
And then when it comes like with purification stuff, some go with this claim to have such strong relationships with the gods that the gods were more likely to answer their prayers, to get blessings and that sort of thing. And that's where the efficacy came from.
Yeah, like it hinges on relationship with the divine rather than you necessarily suddenly gaining more power than the divine.
And that also includes things like the magical properties of gemstones or herbs or things of that nature. Like that was thought to be divine knowledge passed on through mythical figures, sometimes Orpheus, quite often Orpheus. But like, you see the like Orphic Lithica, like they are like Orpheus said this, and here's this big long poem of him explaining all of these things you can do. Like even things where like the material itself was supposed to have some kind of magical property, it's the process of inscribing it with the symbols and like either like requesting a blessing, because typically these had verbal charms and things that were said over them. There was a whole ritual process quite often. There is this idea that even the inherent properties of animals, plants, etc., they're magical because the gods have deemed it so, and not for another reason.
Yeah, or they exist in some like extraordinary circumstance, like moon dew, or is it moon milk, whatever it's called, moon sap, the water on plants from the full moon that then have magical properties because they have gained this divine essence because of because they were formed in an extraordinary circumstance.
Or I mean, like the dove fat from the earlier example, right? Like it's not magical because there's some inherent property to dove fat. It's because Aphrodite likes doves.
Yeah, there's the context rather than anything else.
So I guess getting into what are some other sort of like mistaken things. And again, I'm not necessarily saying nobody should ever be like, you don't have to practice magic to be a Hellenist.
No.
Hell, you don't even have to be okay with other people practicing magic as long as you're not an asshole about it. Like the big thing is that when it becomes a prescriptivist statement, where in communities that are meant to represent the wider community, like, if you were to say magic is automatically hubris and Hellenism, I would get into a fight with you. Not because I practice magic.
I would say you're wrong.
Yeah, so would I. Like, I'd be like, well, the ancient Greeks certainly didn't think that, or we wouldn't have so many damn curse tablets. But, like, again, the sheer number of curse tablets just in the one well on the Acropolis just itself is its own thing. Like, rip the people who are drinking out of that. But, like, when you're talking about, like, the whole magic being hubris thing, the problem in the community, I think, is that there is this sort of older history. And so you have this persistent myth, and like how many times, at least 15 times in Hieros alone in the past like 2 weeks, people have been asking about this. People ask about it in the bridge all the time too when they first come in, like in our question section. Like it's so pervasive, this myth that like all of Hellenism is Neoplatonist, and all of like everybody believed the same things that like Plato and Plotinus did, and that sort of like, no, these guys were philosophers. They mostly educated like the rich who could hang around with them in the academy.
They also often wax about ideals, and the fact that these were ideal states really means that they weren't the reality. Because if they were the reality, you wouldn't have to say in an ideal world this would be the philosophical perfection, because it doesn't exist, and that's probably because most people didn't follow the same thing.
Well, and I also think that people who either don't want to practice magic or think it's hubris, they have a right to form their own small communities as long as they are upfront with the fact that that's what they believe, and you can choose just not to join those. The problem comes when you have people that are pitching communities or larger spaces, and they're trying to force those beliefs and those philosophies onto everybody as though they are representative of the whole of all of Hellenism.
Yeah, you don't have to practice magic in Hellenism, but you are incorrect to say that there is no place for magic in Hellenism.
Yeah, there might be no place for magic in your specific tradition because of
Yeah.
your specific theological beliefs. And if there are a bunch of people who agree with you, go build a Discord server and keep to yourselves
Yeah.
and don't be butts when you're in other communities. But if you're trying to say you speak for the gods, again, that's where we're going to start butting heads because,
Yeah.
like, philosophical disagreement is at the core of ancient Greek thought. Like, just Greek culture was built in part on that.
Yeah, you can have, again, these little microcosms, like there's little like tiny groups where, not necessarily tiny groups, but smaller groups where everyone is on the same page. You know, fine. It's like a little, I almost said cult, which was, I meant cult in a different sense to the word. That,
Cultists,
yeah, like, little, I think earlier on you were talking about, denominations of Christianity, that kind of vibe.
Yeah, that we were doing prep work for the stream, and I was like, it is as though, like, say Lutherans claimed that the only people who get to call themselves Christians are Lutherans, which I mean, like, some of them do that, but obviously the word Christianity includes Catholics, whether people like it or not. It includes Mormons, it includes Episcopalians, like Lutherans, Seventh Day Adventists, all number of different beliefs, like Baptists, and all of them believe slightly different things. Right?
Yeah, you can have your own beliefs in the little groups, but it doesn't give you authority to then go into a wider group and be like, you're all wrong, like you all are somehow lesser Hellenists because you included magic, or you're all hubristic because you have magic. And it's like, no, your beliefs, maybe that's fair enough, you do, but you don't get to twist the historical narrative just to fit a very specific group of opinions.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like when you go looking in the Bible for anything, right? Like, there's such a wide corpus of writings and things. You can find evidence for almost any theological position. If you go through the stuff, you can pick and choose things. And, like, the philosophers and the Hippocratics are going to be like your richest source if you really want to be like, magic is bad. But, like, unfortunately, the sheer weight of evidence outside of just writing is going to completely bury you if you want to say that all ancient Greeks thought that way.
Yeah, because you take, you go for a wander around a museum and like, I'm just going to look at any of the amulets, I'm just going to look at any of the curse tablets. Those don't exist, because if you look at them, then that's proof that what you're saying isn't true, because otherwise they wouldn't exist.
Well, and also the line between things like amulets and votive offerings also gets kind of blurry at times.
Yeah,
especially when you look at like votive offerings that were left on home altars and stuff.
Or the Colossus of Rhodes. It's just a giant votive offering that's also was meant to be like an automaton, like
Well, I mean, like half the statues
amulet.
in the like temples were giant votive offerings, where like rich people were like, "This god did a great thing for me, and also I want to show off for the community. Look how much wealth I have."
But the things like the Colossus of Rhodes were also, the whole point of them is that they were meant to be protective, so they had a low-key magical function. And there's some, I can't forget what it's called. There's a paper called, it's like Hephaestus the Magician, or something, and it's like how a lot of these some of these automatons had little like scraps of paper with like incantations inserted into them. So although they might just look like a normal votive statue, they had these like hidden magical formulae inserted into them. It's very good paper. It's Hephaestus the Magician. I think it's like an alchemist's watchdogs or something, about magical automata.
Well, and I think that when you're talking about, so like going back to, I guess, like some of the modern arguments, I think that ultimately what it comes down to, for me at least, is I don't practice magic, like for the most part. I used to, like back before I became a Hellenist. I don't not practice it because I don't believe in it or something, or I don't because I think it's hubris. I lost the desire to, like, after I started engaging in reciprocity. Like, I'm just fine with offering myself, but I'm going to defend the hell out of people who do, because there is a strong historical basis for it, and a lot of people do feel called that way, and religion is personal. Like, it is as ancient as our oldest sources that people engaged with the gods in that way.
Yeah.
Like, it goes back to the Bronze Age. By the way, if you guys want to start throwing questions at us, we're getting pretty close to the questions portion, which is going to be like the last 40 minutes to half an hour of the stream or so. So I think in terms of our outline, let's see where we're at.
We're up to the last question, which you kind of touched already. What place might magic practice have for someone who's interested in Hellenism, which you kind of already started on?
Yeah, like we did start on that, and like you are yourself a Hellenist and you do practice this sort of thing, so like you actually might be able to talk about what place it has in like your praxis.
Yeah, I think it's for me it's a positive addition. It's it's another way of utilizing the relationships that you build with the divine. It's another way of further kind of like solidifying a connection to the divine. It's obviously in certain situations, you know, if you pray for XYZ thing, magic fills for me a role that is very much linked to like crises or potential crises. For me, you know, if I will create an amulet to protect from, you know, if I'm going traveling or something, you know, there's a lot of potential risks there. And yeah, I could just pray. I would, but I would also, you know, make an amulet as a physical manifestation of, you know, the power of the gods that I have then used my relationship with them to, you know, make something to ensure or increase the likelihood of, you know, safety or success or something. Or in terms of like active crisis, if something has gone wrong, you know, you could, you know, there's
I don't know if y'all could hear that, but my phone just like fell off a pile of books. I'm sorry if you guys heard that.
There's spells for healing and stuff. I think magic in my religion, it's like prayer plus one. It's like when I don't think just praying is enough and I want something more proactive, magic fills that for me, and it's a manifestation of why, not necessarily why I worship the gods, but one of the positive things that can come out of worshiping the gods, because
it's an extension of your reciprocity then.
Yeah, it's just it for me, prayer is more passive and magic is more active, because magic has a lot more inherent ritualistic formula than prayer necessarily does.
Well, I mean, it's a lot more work typically. Like, again, part of the extraordinary efficacy is the extraordinary effort. Like, I am going to not be reading a lot of the Votis Magicae formulae that, like, there's a lot of just, like, babble speak that was either meant to be written or meant to be spoken, and, like, I'm not even going to try to pronounce most of it, but, like, even just trying to figure out how the hell those are said so that you can get that right, like, in and of itself is work. Like, inscribing the amulets are work, getting the dove fat is work.
Yeah.
You know, like, there's obviously we're going to be, you know, new associations, modern offerings, that kind of thing. Like, soda didn't exist, but, like, wine was basically the Greek soda. You know, like, so in the same way that somebody might offer Coca-Cola to the gods, like, you know, pour one out at the start of their dinner because they have a glass of that, modern magic is going to evolve as well, and the gods are going to be potentially interacting with us and revealing new things, like, on an individual level. So that can just be another aspect of your praxis, and some people might not feel called to it, and some people do, and clearly the gods do interface with some people that way.
I just think it's a very good way to have things that people might call divine experiences. It's a very kind of, a lot of magic is very intimate with the divine, in the sense that it's often very direct interaction and action. Not necessarily all of it, like amulets aren't necessarily the same thing, but not that I think everyone should be cursing every 5 minutes, but just for the sake of an example, curse tablets are often very like direct request, direct response kind of idea. It can be quite a tangible experience for a lot of people, which I think could be very like a very strong way to experience the relationships with the divine, that I think some people don't necessarily get just from standard prayer, just because of how certain people are. So I think for some people, magic would actually be useful in kind of staying committed to the cause, rather than dropping out of it because they don't feel like they're experiencing what they want to be experiencing.
Well, and for some folks too who are struggling with latent Christianity especially, or like struggling with religious trauma, which is kind of a more accurate description for what a lot of latent Christianity comes down to, sometimes engaging with the gods in what feels more like a working relationship rather than the more sort of praise-oriented side of reciprocity can feel safer. Like for some folks, like that can, like, I'm not saying this is like this for everybody who practices magic, but I've met a lot of people who do feel that way. And for some folks, it also can feel like a way to deepen their relationship, and that's the way the gods seem to want to interface with them. Like I have like some folks that I know who feel as though they've been sort of initiated into a modern variation of the mystery traditions by their reactions with the gods. They're not trying to push that out onto the community in any way, so it's basically harmless. But like it helps them feel closer to have this sort of idea of this knowledge that was imparted specifically to them. And I mean, as long as you're not doing something like cutting your hand open and bleeding all over your altar because, you know, people or somebody else's hand for that matter, human sacrifice, people already fucked around and found out, don't do it. Like there's your obligatory don't bleed on your altar if you can avoid it. Like it's one thing if you got a hangnail, it's another thing if you're just like, yeah, I'm gonna take my knife. Like that's unsanitary and it's not healthy and also probably not a great idea. But as long as you're not doing something like that, like the worst that'll happen is you don't get a response.
Yeah, and you know, if you don't get it, try again.
Well, at all times, practice is good. Like energy orb, if you've got the spoons, like going and praying and offering will that it doesn't cause negative things. Like I think this is something that came from the Hittite stream, but like I agree with you on this. The gods want to be worshipped. They want us to engage with them. It's pretty obvious in the fact that like we know they exist in the first place. They could just never interface with us at all and, you know, be left alone. They clearly want some kind of relationship with us.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, magic is just another facet of the relationship with the gods for some people.
And it is. I think to say that magic is somehow, you know, a step further than what is normally just your standard, like what standard, like what people who don't do magic say of God is just it's trying to, you know, create this separation between the Hellenists that do magic and the Hellenists that don't do magic, as if they have to be two separate groups.
Energy Orb, this is a live stream. We are currently responding to people in the chat. I've been waiting for chat questions because we got a whole bunch of them at the start of the stream, but like now we're in the question section and it's like everybody just went quiet because they were listening to us ramble at each other for a while. But we are actually at the question portion, so if anybody has questions specifically related to the topic of magic and hubris, as per usual, rule on the live streams, we don't talk about community drama. I'm not going to talk about any individual content creators. I'm going to talk about the opinions of any individual community. I might vaguely talk about incidents that I've heard about or seen, but that's just as examples for, you know, hey, like if we're talking about this toxic attitude in the community, I've seen this happen, but I'm not going to tell you where, because again, the purpose is to stop the bad behavior, not to shame the individuals. Right? Like Kaz and I both kind of agree that this whole magic is automatically hubris, like forcing that onto the community thing is a problem, which is why we wanted to do this. And like why we plan on doing some follow-up streams and videos and things. But like the big issue is like naming and shaming individuals almost always just causes doubling down versus like let's talk about the reasons why, like let's deal with ideas. Let's deal with ideas and behavior, not individuals and communities. Will I do a video on incantations? I actually cover incantations a bit in my new video, and I do talk about them in my original video on magic that's already on the channel. So if you are looking into that, you can take a look at that. I also talk about some books where you can learn a lot more about like incantation structures and things of that nature, like in the scholarly works that I reference. I talk specifically about where I get my information a lot in this new video. So we have something that's off topic, but it is a question for you, Kaz, it looks like, from Akeda with a $5 super chat.
Yeah. Do you think it's fair to call Puddihep the Hittite Theodora? I mean, personally, I think Puddihep is better because she's iconic queen. But yeah, that's fair. Yeah, they're both. I'm gonna. They're both girl bosses. Like Puddihep was fantastic. She did things that women should not have been able to do, and we love her for it. So yeah, that's fair. That's a fair comparison.
So we kind of just covered that, but Bob asked, do Hellenic polytheists practice modern forms of magic, or is it a specific type of magic? The answer is, if you ask 10 modern Hellenists who practice magic what they practice, you'll get 10 different answers. magic is very personal. So I've met a lot of like Hellenists who practice sort of occulty stuff alongside or as part of their praxis. I've also met some that stick primarily like to the PGM and historical forms of magic or like adapted versions. There are also some folks who like consider magic completely separate from their Hellenism and like won't invoke the Greek gods, but like will practice sort of a form like a Wiccan or a ceremonial magic. Like there's as many answers as there are people. Do you have anything to add to that, Kaz?
No, I think you covered most of that.
So this is a really interesting one, which is what makes a curse done through prayer acceptable? Isn't a curse either way? Wouldn't it technically be hubris because you're judging another? Okay, so the core of hubris isn't judging someone else. That's part of it, but it's not the core of hubris. The core of hubris is about like shaming the other person and taking pleasure in it. Now, the ethics of cursing, I think, is a totally different conversation. But in ancient Greece, specifically, what enabled curses was the action of the gods. If the underworld gods didn't release the daimon that you were trying to ensnare, the curse wouldn't go through.
Yeah. Also, like, what makes a curse is a bit of a... Because curses can be motivated by a lot of different things. You could say if someone, I know, stole your grain, a curse could technically like a justice spell. Use like a more modern phrase for it. Curses aren't inherently just done out of
remember, like in ancient
motivation.
Well, yeah, because like in ancient times, striking back when somebody hurt you, like if somebody say committed hubris against you, it would absolutely be considered just to strike back against them.
Yeah, it's maybe like revenge just sounds bad, but it's not necessarily done just out of purely malicious intent in the sense of like I'm cursing you for no reason except the fact that I don't like you. It can be done as a reaction to an act that's already happened, and you're limited in terms of how you can move back against that.
So we have what is your opinion on curses? Kaz? I just gave mine, which is like my opinion is I don't really practice magic, so I don't have to have an opinion. That's my opinion on curses.
Yeah. I'm not inherently anti-curse. I think there are situations where they are more applicable than others, but I
think if you're a magic practitioner and somebody actually commits hubris against you, then you might have grounds to curse them.
Yeah, I don't think it should be anyone's first reaction to a situation.
I mean, magic generally typically isn't your first reaction to a situation anyway. Like usually you'll go to like mundane means, then like maybe adding prayer on top of that. Like magic is often a last resort. Not everybody treats it that way, but often it's treated that way, like even in the spells themselves.
Yeah, but I think there are, in my opinion and in my practice, there are situations in which they can and maybe even should be utilized. But that's an
hot take personal opinion, guys. Hot take warning there.
Oh yeah. Also, yeah. This is just
all the love and light crowd just like unsubscribed all at once.
But also, it's again, I and Ali is no one's morality police or ethical compass. So that's your decision to make.
Yeah, I'm just somebody who is really good at research, and Kaz is just a pagan who also happens to be a Greek classic scholar. Like neither of us should dictate your practice. If our opinion's going to affect like your opinions that heavily, then like work on developing your own opinions a little more, because like philosophy is good for the soul. So let's see. And how are curses different than how they appear in prayer? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. Can you clarify for Adkoi what you mean there? So we laid out arguments against hubris, but we also talked about some of the reasons why people think it's hubris. A lot of it is just misdefining hubris or using different definitions than we do. Some of it is also, again, there are theological beliefs, like, for example, the gods cause no harm, or rather the gods do nothing that is evil, and that would be classifying curses as evil because, like, often harm inflicted by one thing onto another is classed as evil unless it's nature. And okay, Platonic good, I've literally got drunk and ranted for an hour about Platonic good a long time ago. Not my finest moment, but the point is I have theological issues with a lot of Platonism, and one of the big ones is that saying the gods can commit no evil kind of like then negates the concept of good entirely in terms of trying to define it, which is like my biggest objection to Platonism generally. Like it becomes very navel gazy when you start to try to classify everything the gods could ever do, because good is a term of relativity. There's a whole entire thing like that would be its own stream. It was its own stream forever ago, and I didn't do a great job at it. But like people who are much more versed in Platonic philosophy, if you're very deep into those sets of beliefs, then claiming that the gods can do bad things, which, you know, the sort of selfish motivations of a lot of spells would be considered that by the Platonists, as opposed to Theurgy, which, you know, definitely isn't magic in a trench coat and is only to connect with the gods. Like, ignore all the claims about weather magic. Like that's where a lot of that comes from, and some of it also just comes from the belief that like invocations are for a different purpose than they are, or misunderstanding how the formulae were thought to work, or not understanding the theology that underlies some different magical systems. So the point is that there are grounds that people have to believe that from certain philosophical perspectives, but that doesn't necessarily apply to all of Hellenism. It might apply to their tradition because of their philosophical beliefs, and that's kind of the point we're trying to make in the stream. Do you have anything more to add for that?
No, I'm also I've got lost in the chat. Sorry.
It's pretty active right now.
I know.
All right, so let's see. You know, if something is wrong to do by mundane means, it's wrong to do by magical means. Yes, exactly. That I kind of see the same thing with prayer. Like if you, or in even divination, like I did a whole thing on divination ethics. Like if you wouldn't go peep through like your boyfriend's window to go try to find out like if he's sleeping with someone or not, like if you wouldn't go like stalk him or something like that, you probably shouldn't be trying to divine into what he's doing. Like communicate, trust people, or don't, and like there's problems in your relationship beyond just whatever you think he's doing. So energy orb, this question is, would the gods understand if I slack off from worshiping them for a while? So that's less of a magic question and more just a praxis question. And go watch my beginner video because I go into that pretty in depth. The answer is we can't know what the gods think, but there's probably a damn good chance they do, because like they've been interacting with humans longer than any of us have even been like a thought in the universe.
The gods can commit no evil. Isn't that very modern idea? That depends on which philosophical school you're going in. It's not necessarily a modern idea. As I said, the Platonists would say from ye olde days that the gods can't commit evil because they're against their cosmic nature to be able to do evil, because they are the good, etc., etc., etc. There's not necessarily a modern take. It's just it's not the only take.
So Corey asks a non-magic related question. Also, I covered that in a video also. I talked a little bit about the Homeric afterlife, and I talked a little bit about my own beliefs in that video. However, again, I don't talk a lot about my own theological beliefs on certain topics, because I know that as a content creator, I have a lot of influence on the community, because a lot of people, like when they first come to Hellenism, they find my stuff. So I don't necessarily want to influence your beliefs by talking about my own. However, Kaz, if you'd like to share, you're welcome to.
I generally go follow this. Okay, this is one of the few times I actually kind of fall into the Neoplatonist kind of thing. I do very much ascribe to like the reincarnation of the soul, journey to rejoin the gods kind of idea. I don't really have this idea that the soul gets stuck in like the underworld and stays there, and that's that. I do follow the soul goes through this kind of reincarnation thing, with the end goal being rejoining the retinue of the god that your soul derives from, which is another place in this idea of like
the trains of the chariots of the gods, like the people who's following them.
Yeah.
Athena, Ergani.
So in like the transmigration of the soul, the idea that when your soul is made, you're made as part of the retinue of a specific god, and that's that thing. That's kind of.
Or you just vibrate at the consistency of that god, because like there's also the belief that you can like raise that and like end up in the retinue of another god because of philosophy. That's complicated. However, Anti-alias polygons, that is not a modern idea that the gods can commit no evil. The Christians got it from the Greeks.
Is Hecate actually a goddess of witchcraft, or is that something modern people ascribe to? That's from Bob. Titular, she always was she has for a long time been a goddess associated with magic, like in the olden days. That's not just a modern thing that's been given to her. She's one of the most common deities called upon in magical formula, and obviously mythologically speaking, she has links to the witches of mythology. You know,
Medea
Circe,
especially.
Medea, yeah. So no, she's always been a witchcraft goddess.
Marcella B, even a better reason to go back and watch the VOD. The answer is the ancient people most likely believed it wasn't. There are like theological traditions in which they believe it's not, but that doesn't apply to all of Hellenism. So the answer is it's complicated, but probably not. So let's see.
Got another Akita Mesopotamian question. Would you say Ereshkigal is much like Hecate? Would you say Ereshkigal is much like Persephone? No. At a very kind of superficial level of the Queen of the Underworld thing, they share that. Outside of that, not really. Ereshkigal doesn't go through the whole metamorphosis thing of like agricultural goddess, underworld queen thing that Persephone does. She's of the underworld, always is, always has been. Ereshkigal's linked to, certain justice things. She's linked to the Anunnaki. So not really. I think aside from a very superficial link to the underworld and being female, that's kind of the end of Ereshkigal and Persephone. In fact, I think Ereshkigal and Hecate has probably got more links than Ereshkigal and Persephone do.
Okay, so we have another, is that a Christian belief, that being a pure good? Kaz, I have mangled the crap out of trying to explain this. Would you like to explain the problem of the good in Platonism and like evil in Platonism isn't really a concept that the gods are capable of because evil doesn't really exist. Like evil is kind of that which turns us away from the gods. Like it's an entirely human problem, and a lot of that has like its foundations in some Orphic ideas. If as though the Orphics were even one unified idea either.
Yeah, so obviously it's, in Platonism, it's the gods are the good. The gods are.
They're also everything.
Yeah, but the gods
except for the bad things humans do.
Yeah, it's the idea that the gods are perfect. Not perfect in the sense of like.
They're not omnibenevolent, but they're not capable of evil either.
They're perfect in the sense that they are perfectly everything that they are meant to be, and therefore can't do.
They're also so unique that they are above even the forms.
Yeah. Platonism is complicated and is the whole thing, but essentially the gods can't do bad things because the gods are like perfectly in harmony with the cosmos. So to actively go and do harm is against the nature of that makes them. That's probably the most simple way I could say it, and that still wasn't very simple.
Benja, I have a whole video on that. Go watch that video if you want to know about Zeus. It's one of my oldest videos, and like the audio hurts my soul, but the ideas in it are still good. Okay, good and evil are not completely human concepts in ancient Greek thought because there are multiple ideas of what evil could be. But like to Platonists, evil is that which turns humans away from the gods. It's that which pulls us away from the gods. But again, we're not just talking. Platonism isn't all of Hellenism, and that's kind of the point. Is if you're a Platonist, there's potentially an argument for magic being hubris, but if you want to make that claim and you practice Theurgy, then you're going to have to then figure out like how to defend that you're definitely not practicing magic in a trench coat. But like if you are sticking to your guns and you don't even practice that, then like that's a belief that some people have, but it doesn't apply to all of Hellenism. And it certainly didn't apply to the average ancient Greek. And that's kind of the point of this video is like people try to make that there's a historical argument that all Greeks thought magic was bad. It's like, no, we have such a dearth of ancient evidence that like it's obvious that the majority of people didn't think that.
Yeah. if we miss any questions during that, do let me know, because I got the chat moved very quickly and I lost things. So
yeah, I was scrolling through it slowly, like in the little comment thingy on StreamYard. So let's see. Four-Eyed Kai says, I get the impression that the ancient Greeks know that Theoi was wholly good or evil. Definitively, there's an idea among some of the ancient writers that the gods could be capricious at the very least, that they had their own agendas. They don't always have your specific best interest at heart. Like, for example, in the Iliad, like Zeus swings back and forth as to who he's supporting. Like Athena is competing with like Aphrodite, and they have distinctly different agendas. So, like at one point, Athena accepts offerings from the other side, like, and then just doesn't do anything with them. Like she just doesn't grant the prayer. She's like, "Thanks for the offerings, bye."
Yep.
And so, there's this idea that like the gods, they're beings, which means they have their own motivations and agendas, and sometimes answering your prayer just isn't on the menu today. So, like, that's not necessarily the same thing as being evil, though. Like, defining evil in even within Hellenic philosophy, Aristotle spent an entire, like, gigantic 26 book long treatise just trying to define the word good. Like, what is good and thereby what is virtue? Right? Like, these are such deep philosophical questions that, like, you're gonna ask 10 Hellenists and you'll get 10 different answers, and two of them are, like, debating the philosophical schools rather than agreeing with them. Well, again, Christians got a lot of that from the Neoplatonists. There was a massive movement in the Catholic Church to adopt a lot of Neoplatonic philosophy. They're like, hey, definitely Plato was actually a monotheist, and like he was just trying to please the Athenians. Like, you just need the demiurge, you don't need all the rest. Again, I'm not endorsing that. Somebody's gonna clip me out of context, but like I'm not endorsing that. I'm just like that. If anybody didn't pick that up, that was sarcasm. Again, I'm not a Platonist. I get into arguments with them a lot, so I know a lot about Platonism. You're welcome for answering your questions, Akita.
Marcelo, ignore if you answer blah blah. But ignore if you answered this already? But if the Greeks believed the gods could cause an evil, how did they reconcile the belief with them believing that Poseidon caused earthquakes, etc.? So there's a couple of different ways you can go about this.
Is a natural disaster actually evil?
Is that because is that an evil thing, or is that just part of the world? On the other hand, there's also the argument that Poseidon doesn't cause earthquakes, but daemons in the retinue of Poseidon that are also called Poseidon, because sometimes the daemons in the retinue of gods are smaller versions of that god, and whether they are incapable of doing bad things is a different question, because they're
also bad and good are relative terms. Like, the earthquake might be bad for you, but like it might also be necessary to preserve something about the integrity of the Earth's crust, for example.
Yeah, because since we have cacodemons, we have daemons that represent negative concepts, like, old age or whatever. There is the idea that you could have divine beings,
or even just like the ghosts that are stuck on the planet because their family was too cheap to bury them and didn't mind invoking a bit of Agos.
So there is an idea that there are divine beings that aren't necessarily representations of what we would consider positive things. But
they are still necessary for the order of the universe in some way.
So
like, age is necessary because, like, if we never died, the Earth would completely get buried in overpopulation and there would be no biomass left.
Yeah, so it's a concept. It's a weird one of it's doing, obviously, these kind of things of how do you assign good and bad to a lightning bolt. It's that kind of there's that kind of philosophy swings and roundabouts.
Earthquakes do sometimes kill people. Like, the earthquakes themselves absolutely can kill people. As somebody who has been in one, like, it's not just the buildings falling down that kill people. Sometimes they'll make a crack that people will fall into, or sometimes, like, you could actually hit your head on something and like die because of the earthquake. Like, earthquakes do kill people. But again, like, can you put morality on a natural disaster? But also, there's theological questions in ancient Greece. Sometimes, for example, Agos. Like, Agos is a state of, like, a god rectifying a wrong in the world. It's causing harm to the person, potentially, who invoked it, but the god is also sort of restoring, like, a form of divine order. So, like, even though that's harming the person, is it evil or is that justice? How do you define that? These are, again, philosophers have been wrestling with this for all of history.
Yep.
Energy orb, would the gods accept being a part of a modern day spell? Ask them.
For the question from Corey about cremation, so after 1100 BC, most places still buried their dead in individual graves rather than group graves, which was the norm before 1100. The Athenians cremated their dead, it's true. However, the ashes were then interned in an urn, and the urn could then often be buried or put somewhere, which would then be the act of burial.
Usually a family cemetery if they were like rich enough to have one.
Yeah, it'd be the internment of the urn that contained the ashes.
Yeah, and like that's just a really efficient way to deal with like, you know, urban population centers. But the key is like the burial rites included the cremation. So like that's part of burial is like cremating the body. You know, if you, for example, just like left your loved one on laying there on a battlefield and they refuse to like retrieve them, there's a whole play about why that's a problem.
Yeah, and there's some people in some cases you funeral pyred them in those situations.
Yeah, so that was still a form of burial rites.
Yeah, it's more like, although we're saying if the body wasn't buried, you know, you get angry spirits, but it's more if the burial customs weren't followed, you get angry spirits.
Well, yeah, and if you couldn't find the body, there were rites you could like hire somebody to do, or you could do in the absence of the body, which a lot of modern people are probably going to have to do in absentia rites because like modern funerary practices don't really give you a lot of access to the body to do things like washing it after 3 days and like doing the prayers and the procession and that kind of thing. You'd probably get some weird looks if you decided to like parade your casket down the street.
Yeah.
Energy orb, again, you're asking us very personal questions here. I would not be able to tell you that.
Yeah. Again, the reasons why the gods don't reply to every prayer is above my pay grade.
It's significantly above mine too. Well, I mean, here's another point though. This is something that a friend of mine said, and this is going to probably be a hot take, and it's going to be, I'm going to get clipped out of context. Like this is what I get for doing a live stream. Not everything's about you. You know, like you might have done something you're worried pissed off the gods, and then an earthquake happens. That does not mean you caused the earthquake. The earthquake might have a completely natural origin. Poseidon might be mad at the president or at the king, or, you know, maybe it's completely natural and just the fault line that you happen to live on. Like, you know, if you have a drought and your prayers don't get answered, that doesn't necessarily mean the gods are mad at you or that you don't have enough goddess. It might mean that there's other reasons why the drought's going on, right? Not everything is about you. And like, I think that this is one of these things where we have such a personal form of religion. A lot of us practice by ourselves. It's really easy to lose sight of that when we don't have the sort of communal form of religion as well. Because in ancient Greece, everybody's behavior at the ritual had something to do with the outcome. Like it wasn't just any one individual person. Communal rites existed in addition to the personal ones. It's your goddess and the community's goddess. I mean, it's somewhat a little bit, but it's also just a hyper individualist thing. Like it's an individualistic culture thing, whereas like the ancient Greeks were a little more communal.
Yeah, the community for modern Hellenism is massively different, mainly because we're so disparate.
Yeah, Fel and I have actually had lots of conversations about this. She and I are friends, just so you guys know. And like we actually have had a lot of conversations about that because it's a lesson you have to learn over and over as a pagan, because we do have this hyper individualistic culture to where it's really easy to lose sight of the fact that like the world doesn't revolve around you. Your relationship with the gods is personal, but that doesn't mean they're going to give you everything you want.
They aren't Pez dispensers.
Yeah, they're not vending machines. You don't insert offering and automatically get blessing. Like, that's not how it works. It's a relationship. I mean, in the same way that, like, just because you called your friend doesn't mean they're available to hang out with you on Saturday.
You know, who practice men or even non-binary people. Non-binary people, the whole discussions, the presence of non-binary people as a whole, like, thing, if whether they were existed or they probably did, but they weren't named, and like there's a whole linguistic thing. But for the first part of who practiced magic the most, in terms of in literature, women. In terms of like overwhelmingly in literature, it's always the sorceress. It's always Circe, Medea, Dido, if we're going for like a Roman example. But in terms of outside of like the literatures of like outside of like mythology and folklore and that kind of thing, and plays, the gender disparity isn't really that big.
Well, we also don't know all that much about, like, magic was heavily associated with women in, like, literature, but, like, it seemed like a lot of Magoi were men. However, like, there's just so much we don't know about home worship, which was primarily done by women. Like, a lot of home practice it was led by men quite often, like, for your average sacrifices and stuff, but there's a lot of, like, the cult of Hera we know very little about because it was primarily women.
But chances are, for the most part of applied magic, I don't think there was that big of a general gender difference. I think it would have been situational. A lot of the professional magoi or whatever word you want to use, goers, whatever, would probably have been men. But then at home, or people who did like amulets for childbirth,
magic
would probably have more likely tailored towards women. So it's
most of the clients for curse tablets in Athens specifically probably would have been men, because for a long time women didn't have a lot of rights to leave the house all that much, and like didn't have a lot of like they weren't allowed to spend more than a certain amount of money in a day, like by law. At a certain point they got more rights later, but like in terms of folk magic and stuff, they document, old women say this, like in like the repository of plants from Theophrastus that we were talking about. So again, like there was like farmers' knowledge and folk magic that was passed down among women and in like family lines and stuff. So the answer is everybody probably practiced magic, but different kinds of magic were probably practiced by different people. So let's see. I think we did actually talk about invoking the gods, not just because of the PGM, but like a bunch of different amulets and other things like very clearly invoke the gods. All right, so this is going to be our last question. Most common spells cast by the ancient Greeks, and how were the gods invoked? Curse tablets, and amulets were probably the most common spells.
Yeah, they covered pretty much everything. You get amulet for most things, and if it's if it's protection, healing, business,
including for warding off your enemy's curse tablets. Like if you're doing that, you need to make sure you got your amulet for that too.
PGM is the Greek magical papyri. Papyri Greek magica.
All right, so we are in the last few minutes. So closing thoughts on the overall topic, etc. I'll let you go first, Kaz, because I keep talking over you a little bit.
It's fine. Yeah, overall thoughts. If anyone comes to you and tells you that magic has no place in Hellenism, historically they're incorrect. I think
tell them to kiss your ass from me.
I think we need to live in a world where different groups of people have to have identical beliefs, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they therefore have the authority to tell everyone else that they're somehow inferior. You can believe that what you believe is right, and therefore that inherently means what someone else believes is wrong in relation to you. That doesn't make you therefore an authority that your way is the only way. And I think the issue with magic is that people have taken certain bits of rhetoric, both modern and ancient, and decided that is the only way. For example, you read something that Plato said, you agree with that, so you decide that you therefore are going to spread the rhetoric that anyone who doesn't also follow that is doing it in a way that is, offensive or is, problematic. And I think that's not the way to approach these things, because for one, it's not historically right, and two, it does not create a community that's really, which is what we need. Everyone wants a community, and we can't have a community if every time you meet someone who doesn't follow the same ancient philosopher, they are instantly inferior to you, and their approach to the religion is instantly bad. That's not what we need.
Before I Koi with a $10 super chat says, thank you for the live stream. Thank you so much for the super chat. So I think I want to draw a distinction there too. There might be smaller communities that share a theological position like magic is hubris. And if you don't want to engage with that, like it's okay for those communities to exist as long as they are not like as long as they're honest that that's what their community is built on and as long as they're not claiming to represent all of Hellenism. It's the moment that like it's there is a quote that I really love which is, the your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose. Basically, like you can swing your fist around, you can believe whatever you want, as long as you're not forcing other people to believe that, and as long as you're not claiming that you represent all of the entire breadth of a tradition. Lutherans are Christians, but not all Christians are Lutherans. Like Neoplatonists can be Hellenists, but not all Hellenists are Neoplatonists. The reason I'm picking on them is because they have a tendency, a lot of them tend to be the ones that sort of proselytize on this. So there can be a place for sub communities for people who believe that magic is hubris, and that's fine. They can have their community. You don't have to join it. It's the moment that they start to claim that they represent all the rest of us and that that's the only right way to be. And like that's the distinction and that's the essential thing. Now, I personally don't think magic is hubris. I'm just not all that interested in practicing it. And like that's fine. There's room for people who do. There's room for people who don't. There's room for people who believe that. Co-religiosity to me is more important. Like, do we practice similarly enough that we could join a group ritual together, or are your theological beliefs going to prevent you from being in a ritual with me? And I think that that's a bigger thing to focus on in those sorts of situations. And yes, these books that Kaz are recommending, because folks are interested in magic, I actually cite several of these in my upcoming video, which is Drawing Down the Moon by Edmonds, Oracles and Curses by Idenau, Love Magic by Pharaon, Arcana Mundi by Luck, Magic in Greece and Rome by Watson, and I would also add Magica Hera as well to that, which I also believe is Pharaon.
Yes.
So yeah, with that, we just hit about the 2-hour mark, so that wraps this up. Kaz, are you planning on coming back? We were going to talk about next time you come back on the channel, probably be a couple months out, but we were going to talk about maybe the modern, like roots of modern occultism.
Yep, that's the plan. That would probably be the next one that I would be gracing you all for.
Yep, and also Kaz was a key collaborator. Round of applause in the chat for him on this upcoming video that's coming out next Thursday at 6 p.m. PST on healing magic and protective magic, like apotropaic rites. He checked over all of my work for that. We also discovered discrepancies in one of the sources together, and that was fun.
We did, yeah.
Yeah, we did, because like there was an article that was recommended, and then I found problems trying to cite it, and then we discovered that it was an issue and decided not to use it. So like if you guys want to see, Kaz is an incredible friend of the channel, and so is his server Hieros Elainoas. There's a link in the description below to Hieros Elainoas, which is an allied server, and also to the Xenia Bridge, which is my server. Kaz is actually pretty active in the bridge too, so chances are if you ask a question in Hellenism discussion or Hellenism questions, or if you ask one in the questions chat in the Xenon area, if it's about magic, Kaz is going to magically show up somehow. He just knows.
True. If the word magic or Mesopotamia is mentioned, I come out of the walls.
Yeah, it's literally like it's it's a summoning ritual. Just like say the word and suddenly he's there. All right, so thank you guys so much, and remember, we are stronger together. Have a good night, everybody.